I guess it's a nonprofit technically.
Nonprofit. What did we say?
I think now we're at 6 years. We've been around for almost 6 years.
Yeah. But do we say, we don't say, in some contexts we say firm.
So I also,
had this conversation.
I know, I never call us a firm because it makes it seem too for-profit.
Sure.
I will always say that we're a nonprofit urban design organization.
Yeah, we call ourselves an organization.
Gotcha.
So what is a nonprofit exactly? Like,
That's a great question.
right? Like,
It is a federal designation, an IRS designation that's 501c3, and that means that you have to operate like a business. You have to be able to make sure that you don't go bankrupt and that your revenue covers your expenses. But
You have a board you answer to.
you have to have a board of directors and bylaws, but the primary reason you get that designation is because there is some public service social mission.
Got it.
And that's going to be your primary goal rather than to maximize your profits. But you could have profits as a nonprofit. The only thing that distinguishes a nonprofit is that it's a business with a social mission.
okay.
So, in the world of architecture and being the kind of architect half of the duo between us, it's very healthy to be working in a nonprofit because much like in school where you have a thesis to your project, our organization has a thesis to our work. And the IRS taxes us if we do work outside of that thesis.
Got it.
To put it in architectural terms. So what's really cool is that we have this system for tracking our projects and looking at our projects and making sure they always match our thesis or AKA mission. So we're always looking at the outcome of our work. We call that like fitting into a logic model. And from the outset of a project, we have goals and aims. And then we look back at the project when it's done or wrapped up, and we talked about what we did and what went into the project at the service of those things and what we got out of the project, or what was embedded in the community or done with the community, or what was given to the community. So in some ways, it's very much like how we operate in school and we do projects in school.
Gotcha.
So it's a very critical extension in some ways of that.
So you feel like having the actual official status of being a nonprofit helps keeping you guys on track with everything you're doing?
It mandates us to do that if we were to be a successful nonprofit organization. It also makes us, I would say, eligible for funding from foundations and government entities who see our nonprofit status and know that the work we're going to do is meant to create an impact rather than necessarily maximize our profit.
Do you feel like that also helps your I guess I'm going to say clients, I don't know how you call them, because partners. Do you feel like they trust you more because of the fact that you're a nonprofit versus
we just have a different
design firm?
Or we have a different base of people that we're working with, partnering with, or that we are clients with, or to, or from.
I would say that our partners tend to be other government agencies, other community-based organizations, and oftentimes foundations. And foundations often want to primarily invest in nonprofits because of the kind of the tax implications of that as well. So I think that the trust also comes from the track record of the work we've done and how we've done the work and how we work with community and the outcome of our projects. So we like to think that they start off trusting us maybe a little bit more because we're a nonprofit, but then our track record of how we work means that they can trust us as LA-Más team members.
Yeah, and I would say this happened more 2 years ago where developers would come to us and say, do you want to be a part of this project? Or, it's happening less and less, but we have had to be really intentional about saying no. And I think that is another difference. If we were a for-profit entity, we could say, oh, well, yeah, let's do it and see what happens. But from the outset, we are evaluating the impact that the project has and if it aligns with the stated mission of the organization.
So who does the checking on you guys to make sure that you're staying in line?
We have a board of directors who are actually fiscally responsible for operations. They meet quarterly. It's a great diverse board. We won't go into the individuals, but they all kind of have a diverse perspective of Los Angeles and backgrounds, and we share with them our operations, our finances.
I think it is kind of interesting to list at least professionally what they do. Landscape architect, developer.
Architect, urban planner, academic, someone who works in community development, someone in the foundation space.
That's like
someone
7,
in nonprofit space.
8 people.
Yeah, we have
That's a big board.
We have an 8-member board.
A big board can be 20 people,
Really?
17. Boards can get pretty big.
Yeah, all bylaws are uniquely positioned to kind of shape the needs of individual organizations. So some organizations have gigantic boards.
Oh, yeah. The lawyer.
Our lawyer is very helpful.
So helpful.
And so the board of directors they're not directly involved with the day-to-day. They just make sure that you guys are doing what you're supposed to be doing.
Helen is a master of the update email, and you do an amazing job of updating the board. I would say at least once a month, if not.
We try to do that.
I see.
We try to do that together. And we meet quarterly, so we are required to have quarterly board meetings sometimes. We also have subcommittees that meet for specific reasons, for project related or financial or operation related reasons.
But, when we got really into ADUs, which maybe we'll talk about later, accessory dwelling units or backyard homes, and a big part of that was the conversation we were having at the board level and talking with different people on the board, specifically the urban planner academic and the alternative developer. The two of them have these really incredible conversations that we get to be a part of, and they're really progressive in their fields. So that's a really huge cultural value to us and support network that we have as the board.
But they're not involved in day-to-day. They don't get paid. We take care of the day-to-day. We report to the board. The board approves our salary. But we have the flexibility once they approve our annual budget to decide how much to pay for rent and how to deal with staff salaries and operations and what projects to take on. But they provide a framework. We just actually released our second 3-year strategic plan for any nerds in the audience who want to read about how we're going to grow the next 3
We
years.
do an annual report every year, which I also find very healthy from the creative aspect to go through. It's almost like, again, putting a portfolio together at the end of the year to look at what you've done and put it in context. So we have done 4 annual reports now, or 5? I think 4.
4 that we put online. The first one we decided.
The first one, yeah.
Do you have to list things online?
We like to because it helps people who want to
Transparency.
support
I
us,
see.
like foundations or just even individual donors or other organizations who are thinking about who to partner with. What we put online in terms of our mission, our strategic plan, our audit findings, individual projects, I think it gives potential partners a really good sense of who we are and what we do and what our priorities
This
and
is the
values
first
are.
time we've ever had a conversation about the nonprofit model.
I know, this is really interesting.
Really interesting.
I love your
Maybe
thesis.
we're
I
gonna
love your
talk
thesis
about that.
idea.
It's really clear for architects to understand it that way. It's an interesting thing. So I want to definitely get into the ADU discussion, but I was curious, how did this all start? Because it's a very different thing to decide I'm going to run a nonprofit versus a for-profit business or a firm or an office or whatever you would normally call it.
I am a third-generation architect.
That's got to be
and,
rare.
Yes, I think. Well, I in high school I wanted to be a poet, and I cannot believe my father isn't around for me to yell at him that he was gung ho about that as well. And then I took a studio.
You would be an excellent poet.
Thank you. I did write a lot
It's not
of
too
poetry.
late.
I know.
Not too late.
I'm good. I'm super good. I'm maxed out. But I went into an architecture studio to try it out when I got into college, and it was all of a sudden being a part of a world that I immediately viscerally understood, and I was proficient in, and I just kind of took to it. But out of school, I got really into construction administration, and I did that for 2 years on really big projects like CHLA, Children's Hospital Los Angeles. And there were so many deep intrinsic issues with our ability to innovate on what we were building and the technology becoming outdated before we could install it, that I got really disillusioned with our ability to deliver architecture that matched our values. So I went back to grad school, and I met a bunch of people that were doing innovative stuff abroad. So I worked with them.
Innovative in terms of construction or more?
Mass Design Group is the name of the organization. And they were not a nonprofit, but they were being sponsored by a nonprofit, and they were working on building maternity wards and clinics at the time in Rwanda, and then that expanded to Haiti and across Africa during the time that I was there. So I really, from that work, saw the potential of architecture to be something that was held to a higher standard and that made us all more ambitious in a way that was really productive and positive and fruitful. So it was really from that early learning lesson of having both sides of the coin, where, building a hospital, doing construction administration on a hospital is a civic social good, I would argue.
Yeah.
But it was a for-profit environment. And then going and working in a nonprofit environment in a limited resource setting and kind of understanding how quickly we could innovate because we were working with the Ministry of Health and we were writing policy. So understanding at all the different scales architecture could operate if we just stepped outside of the profit model. If we kind of sidestepped the capitalist needs and we weren't at the service of capitalism directly, it opened up all of this potential for an engagement and a meaningfulness in the work that we all were taught should be there, but we weren't able to practice it out of school.
So engagement, you mean a deeper engagement with the local agencies and local governments and things like this?
Yes, I mean, I think Helen could kind of speak better to the kind of policy, politics, and bureaucracy and how and whether or not that always reflects a community, because in many cases it doesn't. However, it was this whole layer that I didn't know about in school and that outside of school seemed to have another level of agency where we could be engaging things and doing things architecturally in a more sustainable fashion. So, shaping the policy around planning has so much more implications than building one building. But if you build one building and you prove that something is a good idea, then you can get things done in policy, not otherwise foreseeable. So it was like the two things were really linked and had this wonderful relationship that I was excited for us to explore.
Well, it's very well said. It makes sense to me. And I think the frustrations that architects have working, well, let's say specifically with developers, and everything being driven by basically money and what's going to be profitable is a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people. And so that makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting you guys are balanced between like architecture, we call buildings, let's say, and then policy. It seems like you're straddling that line. That's the key thing, right?
Yeah, I think not just straddling the policy, but also the community component. So my background is in public policy and urban planning. I worked in local government. I worked in communities. So a lot of the work that we do in some ways positions us as kind of an urban design nonprofit in between this space where Elizabeth had made this statement a while back, so I'm going to rephrase this, where we're the intermediary between kind of political will and capital and community needs. And so what we end up doing on the engagement front is for all our projects, we want to make sure that what we're doing is actually serving a certain population. And our mission is that we serve underserved and lower income communities. So that means we won't be taking a project in Beverly Hills that's serving someone who's like the 1%, because there's plenty of for-profit entities that could do that and probably do it better than us. Our sweet spot is thinking about how in a resource-limited environment, in a lower budget, shorter timeline, how can we really maximize the impact of those resources? So for us, we have a approach to community engagement where we parachute into neighborhoods and we acknowledge that we're not from there, we don't have roots there, we're not going to be there when the project is done, but what can we do to build a meaningful relationship with the people who are on the ground, the people who are going to be there after a project is gone? So I would say that's the kind of the community engagement part. But to Elizabeth's point, we also work this other part of policy and politics, because we often get hired by elected officials and government agencies who have their own priorities, and there's lots of rules that govern what's allowable. So because we understand that space, and because I used to work in government and kind of appreciate the nuances and the potential there, our projects are always positioned to think about how do we push the boundaries of what's possible, how do we fulfill the goals of stated goals of government agency and elected officials, and really help provide a solution that they may not come up with on their own. So in that sense, with our urban design kind of toolkit of policy and planning and design and construction and architecture engagement, where our hope is that we're thoughtful about the community engagement and the values, and that we acknowledge the reality of politics and policy, and that the work we do has a positive impact.
Yeah. I mean, that all sounds really amazing, but it occurs to me that it's got to be incredibly difficult as I like the word parachute in. I think that's a great phrase, to parachute in and then say, let us learn about your community, let us help you. That sounds like an extremely difficult process. And then also to try and tackle on the government side of things, I feel like you'd be met with a lot of red tape. How does this process even work?
I would say, if you could talk a little bit about because I mentioned I'm a third generation architect, I think it is relevant to talk
Well, I am a child of working class immigrants. I'm American-born Chinese, ABC, and I think that perspective.
ABC, not a banana.
Not a banana.
And I think that perspective helps me understand what it's like to be in a community that hasn't had a lot of resources, that hasn't had a lot of investments, has had a lot of promises, and so I intuitively understand kind of the promise that has always kind of never realized, and knowing that when you do work in communities with people like myself, that there is a way to do it that's really authentic. So we have members of our team that do lead the community engagement, that have commitment and experience in social justice. They've experienced being community organizers, and they feel really comfortable going into neighborhoods like Watts to South LA and feeling like that's their home, and that they can speak in a way where there isn't a hierarchy, and that there is this cultural understanding. So I think that is essential to how we build our kind of community engagement. And
our office reflects the diversity of Los Angeles. Our office, we've worked really hard for our office to represent the communities of the cities that we're working in. But also, I mean, it is so brutal that you said parachute in, and it's more like drive for 15 minutes to a location. I think that Helen holds herself to an incredibly high standard about the notion of where you're from and where you have a right to speak, or what you have a right to speak to. And that we never take our own voice as someone else's. And so I think it's that. And then my background, coming from generations of people who saw the social value of architecture, I think we have just really high level of ethics and values that we assign to what the takeaway from our efforts are.
Well, parachute could be positive.
It's so brutal.
Your
no,
parachute,
it's not. No one ever parachuted in and everyone was like, yay, they've joined us for dinner. That's not how parachuting in works.
That's what I was hoping. I was like,
no, it's brutal.
You see something coming, you're like, I'm a little suspicious, but they land, and they're like, that's
they bring gifts? No.
And then they're like, okay, not so bad. We'll welcome them to our community. And then when you're ready to fly away, that's okay too. And you're welcome to come back in the future.
No, that has never happened.
Only when Helen parachutes in. What generation are you?
I'm a second generation.
I always
my parents are immigrants. My parents are immigrants from China. And I was born in Los Angeles, actually in Chinatown. Wow. And my parents don't speak English really. And so my sister and I speak Cantonese at home.
Cantonese. That's becoming more and more rare.
It is. It's too bad I didn't speak Mandarin, because that's the language that would dominate the world.
But if you transition from Cantonese to Mandarin, it should, in theory, be easier than the other way.
People who speak Mandarin are trying to understand Cantonese.
Yeah.
So I have a little bit of a leg up, and I can probably speak like a second grader in Mandarin.
That's decent. At least they see that you're trying, I suppose. Yeah. So Los Angeles has a heavy Hispanic community. There's a lot of Hispanics here. Do you both speak Spanish?
I speak enough Spanish to get by.
I can understand it, and I've been told I speak it much better if I'm drunk.
I was going to say, with a little bit of alcohol, it always helps.
I grew up in Los Angeles, and my classmates I went to school with were primarily all immigrants from Asian and Latin America.
Interesting, yeah.
So how did you guys...
Yeah, for better or worse, my dad was a Francophile, and so I got dropped off on a farm in France for 6 months.
Oh, nice.
And so, and said, learn how to speak French, and I did not quite accomplish that, but it's always been, a kind of wonderful gift to have access to the French culture, but then always this really bizarre sticking point, because the French language is it'll sabotage you from being able to speak Spanish, which is why I don't actively, I'll listen and understand quite a bit, but I'll say jardin rather than jardin and stuff like that.
I studied Spanish and Italian, and I got really confused between the two for a little while.
And our name, LA-Más, Más means more.
Yeah.
More in Spanish.
For the most.
How did you come up with that name?
Our co-founder, Mia Lair, she's El Salvadorian, and she came up with a name, and she really liked the idea of giving the most for Los Angeles and giving back to the communities and with the most you could give.
Very nice.
Yeah.
So when you enter these communities and you're trying to learn about them, and I imagine that sometimes you are met with a bit of confrontation because you're somewhat of a stranger, let's say. What do you do to try and facilitate open conversation, get them to trust you and to learn, the specificities about their kind of culture and neighborhood and et cetera?
So I would say that when we work in a new community, there's always someone who's inviting us. So sometimes it's another community-based organization, sometimes it's an elected official. And so that's a good starting point to just, have someone invite you in. But once we're invited in, given our nonprofit status and given the type of work we do, we often get to have an open-ended conversation in some ways where the parameters of our project aren't baked. So having conversations and hearing, based on what you're hearing, you can actually really integrate it in whatever we're doing. So for almost all of our projects, we want to start by listening first without actually saying, here's our solution, what do you think about it? And I think that's actually one of the challenges of typical community engagement. That's a check off the box where you speak at people, you give them some options that are already baked, and whatever they say, you're still going to do what you have planned to do in the first place. So our projects try to avoid that. And I think that informal conversations and acknowledging who's there and the history and the culture and the context is something that we spend time doing.
But on the other side of things, there's this kind of asinine conversation around community engaged design processes. And it's just like, I find it very transparently creating, fake proximities or fake intimacies. And the idea that a community member would say, I love blue. Blue's great. Let's make it blue. Or, this shape, I like that. And it's so, individualized that, when we do larger public projects, public realm work, community engagement at that level is very futile, frustrating, unproductive. When we talk about values, when we talk about issues, when we talk about how someone, is struggling to navigate a sidewalk, real tangible challenges that people are facing, that is when, we're sitting at the table and designing. But there are numerous organizations that I find very frustrating and transparently pretending to do something they're not. And they have, kind of binders of mosaics that the community has participated in, or murals, which I find in some ways to be a sign of disinvestment.
Cop-out.
Yeah, they're cop-outs. They're really kind of a transactional way in involving someone and making them feel like heard and included.
And there may not be anything wrong with that.
So you're going to be positive about it. I think that but here's the deal is like, I don't want, if you're a designer or an architect and you're excited about getting into working with the community, if you show them like a kind of swatch index of colors and think that you've had a conversation about the issues present and use your design education to facilitate that, you're wrong. And like, I want to be super clear about that because that's not productive.
Well, I think that there's some organizations who are not designers, but they facilitate architects being actually the tool to help community shape what they want. And I think that's a different approach that's different from what we do. And there's nothing wrong with that because I think that sometimes it's okay for community members to, the fact that you can actually see the physical outcome that you've decided that you've actually contributed to, regardless if someone who thinks like that's good design, like I think that's another issue. Like maybe it's good design, maybe it's bad design. But what it is that it is a reflection of community investment, like physical, tangible equity. And if you separate the side of the
transactional nature of it,
the nature of thinking of what is good design and what is bad design, I believe that there's nothing wrong with that, and it's just like a different style of doing community development. Because I think for some people, they're actually having the community select who the architect is.
Well, so I would challenge you to show me that project and for you to actually like the larger project. I find that it's symptomatic of an approach that is heavy-handed, and we end up looking at these projects and they have like a $500,000 budget to redo an alley, and there's stormwater infiltration and there's like federal grants, and everyone pats themselves on the back, and there's still like poverty and people don't understand their tenant rights. They still have all of these deep intrinsic issues, and oh, congratulations, you upgraded an alley for $500,000 or maybe even $2 million. So I find that those
Wait, are these real things that you're referencing? close to it at least?
Yeah, these are. I'm referencing a real project we went to go see that had this kind of community engagement process.
I think there's a type of infrastructure investment that is in the couple $1 million that often require a community engagement process. So Elizabeth is criticizing that, like, it's a shame that that was the outcome of that project.
Because the community engagement process gets put in, this is where the sweet mosaic's going to go, or this is where, like, we're going to put handprints on the wall from the children of the community. But you don't actually, like, tease out, they don't need an alley to do stormwater remediation. They need, like, housing stabilization. They need, access to healthy food. There are all these things, but they're not there to do that, and they didn't actually ask anyone what they needed, so they're there to put the thing that the council office was like, okay, sure, great. I mean, it's just like a thought process more that I'm reacting to than bad design, which is also bad design.
I'm only reacting to that. I think that
I sound like I'm just being kind of like a little snobby about the design.
The design, the process, and the outcome of the project. So I only want to highlight the positive part, which is that there is a way for community to be engaged that is different than the typical engagement process. And I think that there is a range of what that level of transaction is, the level of feedback, the level of involvement, and what we're doing has a very specific approach because we have an approach to what is the type of engagement we want to do. But I would say that there's nothing wrong with the other way of doing it, even though it's not our way.
I get what you both are saying. I think.
I agree with what Helen's saying as well.
I mean, it's easy to understand that for a person who contributed to a mural or did a handprint, that they feel an immediate and very powerful connection to that thing, and possibly by extension, the larger project. But I can also understand where that's a very dangerous way to do a collaborative
buy-in.
process. Right.
It's like a super dangerous way to be like, okay, we're going to just take care of all this real shit, and then you come in and put your handprints on it and feel emotionally connected. That's not fair. That's not fair to me, and I think that's a dangerous way for architects to get involved if they really want to get involved.
Well, I also think that there is community building, and what if those people in the community said, what I want to see is I want to see our community members reflected in the physical built realm, and then what came out of it was a mural with handprints, and that's perfectly fine. Or I think we're assuming that they weren't involved in the beginning of the conversation.
Right.
So.
Right.
Yes.
It seems like a lost opportunity. And it seems like a cheap way to get people involved and to get people excited, but they don't become more educated, perhaps, on the more complicated issues or the issues that really matter. And it sounds like that's what you're saying. And
I would say that it's not the community members. It's not incumbent on the community member to get educated because they're educated. They know it. They're living it. It's incumbent on that team that's coming in offering an investment to get educated on the issues. And so Helen is right. I'm making the assumption that they're not doing that because I find design as a tool for education. So when we go out and we're like, we need to do something here, we know we have to get educated. So I just want to be super clear that the community is educated. Like, they don't need to know how to do planning to be able to say how I'm living isn't healthy,
But perhaps, I guess, the real trick is when you are discussing these kinds of issues with the individuals of the community, I suppose the challenge would be to get all these very small bits of information that are highly individualized and somehow weave a larger story and a larger narrative, not for any kind of lofty or flimsy reason, but for more practical reasons even, and to have that become something greater than just individual handprints on a wall, let's say, right?
And that's, I think, the approach that we have, where we do get lots of little bits of information, nuggets of gold, and being able to weave that into a broad thesis that it kind of is as inclusive as possible. I think about some of our public realm projects where one is in Northeast LA, a project where we did first last mile interventions, and like what we heard there was like, we just don't feel safe.
It's usually not that.
It's not that profound. It's like, we don't feel safe. I'm not walking because I have a car and I just prefer to walk. It's like, I can't afford a car. I have no choice but to walk and take public transit. To something like the community near Koreatown in our Welcome to Western project, where what we learned was like, it's really sunny and there's not a lot of greenery. Like we just want there to be more green. So there ends up being some kind of theme that is broad, that everything we've heard kind of fits into that. And that's where we start with when we start the design process to actually understand what are the broad community values.
I see.
And it sounds so simple, like I don't feel safe and I can't afford a car. So I don't know how to walk this stretch to be able to get between a metro stop and a kind of bus node of bus stops. But Salita Reynolds, and I am never good. She's the general manager of Department of Transportation
For the city of Los Angeles.
Yes. Oh, so Salita Reynolds said this really incredible point, which was, how often does it take a single mother taking her child between like daycare and her grandmother's house so that she can go do continuing education after her second job? How long does it take for her to give up when she's navigating over on-ramps and cars coming at her and a lack of like curb cuts for the stroller? Like 1 week, 1 day, like how long does it take for her to give up? Because it's not long. It is scary. It's cars are the number one way children die in Los Angeles until they're 13.
Really?
Wow.
Yes. And it's the environment. The environment sucks, and that's why we do our public realm work. Because it is not tenable for people to get up and do better because the city doesn't communicate that that's a goal that we have through our public space, our sidewalks, and how the street is structured. It's structured for cars, it's not structured for people, and it's certainly not structured for people like someone who's trying to do better and they're barely able to get by.
So what are some things that you think could happen to the city, changes to the city, to the environment to make it more safe and walkable and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? If you were given,
Really big question.
puppet control, master control of everything.
I think that the city's in some ways trying to figure out how to prioritize investments in the sidewalk over the street. So rather than moving cars, they're thinking about how to move people who are walking the sidewalks, bicyclists who are on the street. But I think that LA is so big that the level of investment that's needed really requires kind of like a complete transformation.
Right.
So
And money.
money.
If the general manager of the Department of Transportation is saying this,
Yeah.
she's saying this, right? And she's like, she is the boss to every single traffic cop. Like, she's got a big job. So it's not that there's not the will there. It's just that the way that we built LA was a bunch of dead white men who didn't really know what they were doing. And we have to now deal with it.
Are you talking about LA or like a lot of other things in the world?
Yeah, no, everything essentially. Thanks, guys. We're dealing with it.
And what's interesting is that where there is development and investment is where you're actually going to get a better pedestrian experience, because the developers that are building things are required to like update the sidewalk and make it a more walkable, pedestrian-friendly place. But then in places where there isn't that investment and development, in parts of LA where the market isn't as hot, you really have to fight for the funds to be able to do that.
Yeah. So in Frogtown, where Helen's parents live and where you were raised for most of your life, you always mentioned that there weren't sidewalk lights.
Yeah, there were no sidewalks and there were no lights. And
Until maybe 5 years ago.
let's see. So our lights actually came because of our former Congressmember Javier Becerra, who is now our Attorney General. He had to fight for pork money in the federal government, like compete
Like
for
that big scale.
in order to get lights, because a light is like $200,000 per light pole. And then some of our sidewalks haven't been around because it's a residential and a commercial manufacturing, adjacently zoned neighborhood. So
The idea that there's a community within 15 minutes of downtown that doesn't have lights on the street is crazy town.
I think we're waiting for our last third of lights.
And the housing is going at an average of now like $750,000.
Yeah, we had our highest like I
$1
think there's
million.
over $1 million. And that's symptomatic of Los Angeles having a housing crisis, having a homelessness crisis, and the fact that more people want to live here, and there's not enough stock, and so the value, in some ways basic like supply and demand, but that is something that really pushes out people who are lower income, working class families who previously was able to find some creative solution to their housing and transportation and job options. And today it's much harder.
Yeah, that's what all the all the ADU conversation comes in play. Like, do you guys think that the ADU, if they're developed correctly, could help the homeless crisis in a way?
Not necessarily the homelessness crisis, but I think we can have a small contribution to reducing, actually increasing the number of affordable housing units. We need a whole bunch of solutions. Accessory dwelling units are one small solution to it, but I think the ingenious part that we like to say is that rather than relying on government or nonprofit organizations to develop affordable housing, we're enabling the average homeowner to become providers of affordable housing.
Right.
But you kind of have to educate the homeowner too, right? To have some kind of mission if they do an ADU, right? Or do they have to respect a certain types of criteria so they don't, just do a bunch of Airbnb with it?
No. So just to back up, that's an assumption on who that homeowner group is. We're working with low to moderate income homeowners who cannot qualify for a traditional loan product.
Okay.
So from the outset, we're working with a population that is doing wealth building. They haven't been offered, a second loan to be able to do an ADU, and we've partnered with Self-Help Credit Union
and Genesis LA to make that possible. So it's not a predatory mortgage loan. It's something that it can financially make sense because as a team, we've been able to bring partners together to be able to commit to an ADU that is well designed but also affordably constructed. So it's a it financially makes sense. The rent that they're going to get is going to pay off.
Yeah. So, the thing that I'm super allergic to is seeing all these Dwell toolboxes, tool sheds that sit in people's backyard, and they're like, look at how fucking flexible this thing is, and it can, and all the outlets are just built into the wall, and you can't even see them, and like the entire house glows to wake you up and pats you on the back, and it's just like, that is someone who doesn't need to make money off of that backyard home. And there's 99% of the rest of Los Angeles that aren't going to be building studios. And they might not they probably won't qualify for a loan because that construction project is seen as risky. And they're seen as risky. So we're working with that population from the outset. And they are, as I mentioned, don't need an education because they're a community member that is already well aware of their community shrinking and having less and less access to housing. So from the outset, they have a higher competency in their understanding of the challenges relative to affordability.
And I think we're not trying to convince people who otherwise would do Airbnb. Like, those people are going to do Airbnb.
They're going to hire an expensive architect, and they're going to get something that someone's going to pay a lot of money to stay in.
We created the Backyard Homes Project, which is our ADU initiative that is really meant to provide a service to homeowners where they earn income, they build equity, and in exchange, they commit to housing someone who's low income for 5 years through the Section 8 program. So we kind of lay it out clear. Here are designs, here's the price points, here's a financial product if you need it, here's our process, here's what we need from you. If that all sounds good to you, sign up and we'll work with you. And I think we have over 140 homeowners in Los Angeles who aren't getting free money, but they see the value proposition. They either want to help out, or they see this as a value proposition for themselves to building equity.
I mean, it's just kind of crazy. Like, can you imagine being an architect and having 140 people ask you to build them a home?
No.
Like, it's cool. It's really fun. It's really amazing. And it also shows that we're offering something that people need. Mm-hmm. And it's not just kind of aesthetic conversations about the scalability of a parametric system. It's a completely different conversation.
And then for me, as like a policy wonk, an urban planner, I'm like, only 140. We need 100,000 units in Los Angeles.
Baby steps.
But
baby
I mean,
steps.
you asked us about you asked us about this housing thing, and I think it is strange and bizarre to me that in a culture that's so obsessed with imagery and images, people don't read as much anymore. People are on the internet looking at photos. We so devalue the power of an image. And for Los Angeles to invest in an alternate density of doubling our residential to having not one family but two families living on it is radical. So if we just even change, you kind of hinted at, can the backyard home solve the housing crisis? And that's one of these things that ends up happening with architects, I find, and other progressive people, is that we put this really big statement and forward that nothing can ever do. Nothing can ever solve the housing crisis. There's no one thing that's going to do that. However, the notion that we are changing, subverting, redefining the vision of Los Angeles to accommodate more people is radical and necessary. And so I think it's really important that these homes reflect the kind of diversity of the character of the city, but also a vision for a future where more people can live here. And that's really an ephemeral point, that one that we don't get to talk about like 90% of the time because people aren't going to pay for that. But something that is, in some ways the biggest point to me from my side of things is offering more visions for Los Angeles so that it can develop sustainably and be more inclusive and offer more opportunities to more people, which is the point of the city itself.
There is a traditional affordable housing industry as well as a permanent supportive housing industry led by kind of amazing leaders that kind of use a string of resources to try to compile projects that take a really long time. They often cost over $500,000 per unit and take multiple years to build. So what's exciting about this ADU program is that we're just providing an alternative that doesn't necessarily require all that resources, all that time, all that money, and it for the first time kind of invites perhaps like the former NIMBY to become a YIMBY and say, yes, in my backyard, do I want housing, and I'm willing to house someone for 5 years that may not have had the resources I've had.
Yeah, and also, I'm so tired of people saying, these people just don't want anything built. They just don't like development at any cost. And it's that they want to be included in it, and they want it to benefit them as well. And they want to be able to
the homeowners.
choose. Yes. Yeah. It's not like, and we found this out from our Futuro to Frogtown project, people who were really not wanting a big affordable housing project, but wanting to affordably house people in their backyard. And it's that kind of nuance that's really exciting about our collaboration and our work, is that we get to unpack what no is, and that it's not a hard line, but it's a negotiation between what someone wants and needs and what they're trying to convey to you and your preconceived notion of what they should be saying to you.
Right.
The nuance, no.
The nuance, no.
And the nuance, yes.
Yeah.
Going back to your statements about this kind of larger vision or image of Los Angeles, do you feel like maybe that is not established yet, and that's part of the reason why some of these things haven't been better addressed more quickly, or et cetera?
I think it's hard to say what is the larger established vision. I think that everyone has a different vision for what they want to see. Mm-hmm. And because we're at a crisis point, it should be a conversation with everyone, the people with money, the people who are renters, the people who make policy. And I think that's something that was we attempt to have that with some, policy measures like Measure S and Senate Bill 13. So for those listening, just Google that, which is this idea of in order to accommodate more people, we just need to increase our density. And I think it's not just about density and housing more people. It's everything. It's how do people move? Where do people work? How do people go to school? How does LA still become a place of opportunity? And how is it truly a sanctuary city? So I think when you say what's the image in the future of LA, you can talk about it from a singular perspective of housing, but I think that is short-sighted because you really have to think about the city and its complex nuances of what does it mean to live.
Right.
And I think about the really amazing stuff that Frank Gehry and Ed Ruscha did in the 80s to capture where LA was, to kind of capture how much chain link there was in the city, how it kind of terrorized the pedestrian was, but also how institutions like LA-Más, which Ruscha rendered as being on fire, how precarious all of our institutions seemed at that moment. And so it was really, I wish there were more people that were creative that were capturing where LA is now. rather than these kind of glossy towers or hyper articulated, high density, Tom Main guided development projects. I mean, it would be really great if someone could capture where it is now so that we could really talk about it. Because I find more often than not, we're taking a back seat to that, and we're instead being kind of in the relationship of supply and demand, where someone comes to us and says, I'm demanding from you a rendering for like a 5-story tower and da-da-da. I just wish that architects were kind of back in the place where we were using our creative and critical skills to represent a Los Angeles that is in need of help.
I'm going to put a plug for the city's first Chief Design Officer, Chris Hawthorne, the former LA Times architectural critic, who is now in a position of being inside government, working for the mayor's office, and trying to figure out kind of how could that, like, what does that look like? We recently participated in his third LA series, which is in its something edition, which is all online, and I think that's actually an interesting set of conversations that if it was produced into an installation or a discussion series for all of Los Angeles, could really be an interesting model of what does growth look like.
He is in a great place in that he does have that critical background, and it would be really good if he, like Philip Johnson did in, I think, the 30s when he did his housing exhibition in New York, or not housing, modernism. There's going to be tons of architects like cringing at my lack of specificity relative to this point. But it would be really fantastic if Hawthorne did something like that, where it was a critical conversation that he could guide on housing, and that he could get some really amazing people to discuss housing in America and what it looks like and who it's for, and is housing a basic human right, or is it something that proves that you're a good capitalist? And really getting into that and having Los Angeles be at the seat of that, because to date, we've been allowing awful developers like Jeffrey Palmer to define housing, and Christopher Hawthorne could really change that and choose for there to be incredible architects redefining it as a civic moment that is timeless and durable and serving social function.
Yeah.
And I would broaden that invitation to not just architects, but to kind of
I'm
designers
sorry,
broadly, because if architects were to have conversations on their own,
it is so boring. It's exciting because you're here.
But I think it's more that this notion that like a developer on their own, a planner on their own, an architect on their own, an organizer on their own could do any of these things is again undermines the potential of this really like cross-disciplinary approach where people with money, with land, with policymaking capacities, with design sensibilities, like it's actually so much more if you can bring that all together. So spaces, it's been so much fun for me the last 6 years to have limited to no design sensibilities before I met Elizabeth, to kind of be able to understand this whole different world of possibility. And then I'm also learning that from my other peers who come from community organizing, who come from development. And I think it's when you have conversations beyond the way that you were trained or beyond your own discipline, which is actually much more like expansive.
I think it's really interesting that you both see the discourse around these issues, and even as going really specific, like the renderings that depict Los Angeles as being almost really essential to this larger movement, let's call it, and in addition to the actual built work that's happening at the ground level. I think that's really, really fascinating. Could LA-Más... It's because I met someone who works at the nonprofit, and she had first told me it was LA-Más, and so since then it's been in my head.
No, she never.
No, she didn't.
That's bullshit.
I take it back. I don't want to get someone in trouble.
LA-Más, the most, LA-Más, it's...
Could LA-Más be possibly the one to head up that in some way? Or to help tackle those issues in some way?
I am so tired of us being out here doing our thing. I would like other cross-disciplinary groups to start nonprofits around this space of like community need and development pressure. I don't want to, we're not doing a collaborative thing for us to lead anything. We're doing it so that we can have a conversation with peers that we respect and admire, get to work with them and collaborate with them, and surprise ourselves. So,
I would say we're not uniquely positioned to do that. And I think there are, You know, it's a different type of, maybe if we got like a gigantic grant where we're like, okay,
No.
we can.
No.
No.
We would never apply for a grant to have a conversation about something.
No, but I think that there are some groups that participate in that. I'm going to put a plug to the Leadership for Urban Renew Network, Learn, and they actually have a conference every year called
they're
Plus Two.
So good. That
Planning
conference is
and
so
Landing
good.
Use Society Summit, and they make it affordable, like $20, and they have amazing speakers, well curated, and it really talks about the future of the city on all different scales.
And Rudy and Asusana have done just awesome work and is Asusana's background in planning as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
So I would say that I've had the most inspiring conversations with planners, really progressive planners, specifically, you know, USC, but UCLA, these planners, they're just so cool. But that's because we're here. I'm sure planners everywhere are amazing. And it's been really inspiring for me because they've been looking at things like cyclovia. They've been looking at these alternate forms of planning that are kind of non-classical. The planners of today seem way more radical than the architects of today.
And what's interesting is that the city, you know, a government doesn't have like an architecture department, but they have like a planning department. And LA's planning department is the largest in the nation.
And they just like hired a ton of people.
I think they're like over 400 staff people, and they're hiring like the very best of planners from across the world.
But they're dealing with what is it going to look like if LA is carless? What does it look like to address housing? They're dealing with all these issues. Whereas I see architects, you know, we get portfolios and it's just material investigations. And I'm like, give me a break with the material investigations. And you just see these poor kids just being jerked around from class to class where they're doing materials, but then they're doing like a, you know, huge development, but then they're doing a house and then they're doing an animation. And it's just such a fractured education now that's so different than the one that I got, you know, that with planners, they're addressing these real core issues in a way. And we're starting to see it in school. You're starting to see some studios addressing these issues. But I think architecture's really lagged behind addressing them.
The more social issues is what you're talking about.
Oh my God, yes.
But I think that there is actually more and more having like architects graduate and not kind of go into a traditional like for-profit architecture firm, but be able to like join a community development corporation or join an advocacy organization, being able to share those skills that is so different. Like I often say, like, you know, if I were to just like make my own PowerPoint presentation and just like,
oh come on, that's so marginal.
Wait, but I'm just saying, like, if I were to like speak and just do my own PowerPoint presentation, it would just be like so bad because now I'm set up. Like I have this precedent of being able to communicate visually beyond just the words I'm saying, and that makes a huge difference. And that makes a huge difference in how we communicate.
I'm really glad that the past 5 years has helped your PowerPoint. That made Harvard work.
That's a tough thing to do, though.
I would also end with saying like that is like I'm saying that's like the beginning part of where like simple design, just graphic design, visuals can communicate something really differently. But we take our projects and we're able to produce something that's physical and built, and that's like the three-dimensional product of an architectural outcome. But that in some ways is better than a planning document that sits on a shelf, which is what most planners end up working on. So yeah, I forgot where I was going.
Well, I mean, I have to also preface this a little bit in that when I met you, you didn't understand. You were very clear that you were suspect about the power of design. You do not, to this day, and I agree with you, like designer labels. You find that something that's designed usually just means it's a luxury good and that it's not for the average person.
It's overpriced.
It's overpriced. And so when we met, you know, I would have certain things and she would say, well, I would never buy that because it's a waste of money. And I think that I do kind of agree. I do agree mostly with you. And I think that that's a shock to most architects. Like, we don't have any frame of reference for how most people see the value of what we're doing. We've gone from seeming like these incredibly intelligent, like Renaissance people to being the kind of facilitator of access to luxury goods. Like, and that was hugely shaping and monumental for me in my development professionally, was to meet you and to have the value of something as a third generation architect. Kind of, I needed to really understand the value of what we were doing because it couldn't just be well designed.
Right. That is interesting.
And now I see the value of
And now
design
for a short point.
for like
Full circle.
for social good.
I'm not going to let you live down the fact that you said, oh, and the PowerPoints are so much better. Thank you.
What I really meant to say was like, how can you communicate something beyond words and text and verbal communication?
Right.
And I think that that is something that planners don't do well. Like most people don't do that well. And if you can actually make something that visually compelling, that has content. So there's lots of, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of visual stuff that looks cool but has no value, no meaning. Like you're not even communicating anything remotely intelligent.
Yeah.
But I think what we do is opposite of that.
Yeah.
And the frightening thing is that some of that stuff is still very evocative and seductive for a lot of people. And they buy into it and they have no idea that it might be lacking soul.
It's like a shell game.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like which one of these 10 different Arc Daily projects is actually doing something? I know, but I'm going to consume all of it.
Right. Well,
So just to back up a little bit, so how big is your team? Like the day-to-day?
7 people.
And they each have different, I don't know,
Yeah, our team
backgrounds.
of 7.
And
We have an amazing operations associate who keeps our business, our financial and operation game on point. And then we have 3 people who have architectural and design and construction backgrounds, and 3 people who have policy and engagement and planning backgrounds.
So for every person, there's a peer that does the mirror kind of activity on a project and that's collaborating with that other person from a different professional perspective.
And I would say that our designers kind of are interested in the policy and engagement, and our community and policy team understand the value of design. And then everyone on our team believes in our mission.
I'm sure that's very important.
yeah.
It's essential.
Going briefly back, the commentary about architects becoming kind of a means to access luxury, and I suppose the counter argument to that is that it requires a lot of money to do something that is aesthetically or architecturally or whatever other word interesting, right? And that's, I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I'm not saying one side or the other is better. And you need that kind of cash to come into the project to feed it to further the discussions about material investigations specifically, or what other kind of investigations to push the profession further, right?
But further towards what?
I don't know.
That's the problem, right?
Yeah.
That freaks me out.
Well,
It's
I
like,
guess
what-
it's...
you sit down with someone like Sylvia Lavin or any of these people that were really pushing a parametric agenda, and Sylvia wouldn't say she did that, but whatever. Hernan at SciArc, and it's like, what's towards what?
Well, I'm thinking, to try and speak for some of these people, which I probably shouldn't be doing, but if we can, have
they would not have gotten to this part in the podcast. I promise you that.
If they're listening, then I don't know. If we can further evolve the architectural language, the language of the built environment, then maybe that's a way to have progress, even socially speaking, right?
But
You know what I mean?
one formalist, pure formal, and I consider myself a formalist, which most people get super upset about. And this means people who call themselves this, they mean that they prioritize form over all other things. And then they're like, well, you're engaged with context, so you can't be a formalist. And I'm like, but how? I don't understand.
You're a redefined formalist?
That's my opinion, but I don't think other people have that opinion. Anyhow, so I think the challenge is, what is OMHey? It's an Instagram meme channel of like, they take photos on Instagram and of projects and they make fun of them. There's like a really fun one of like Rem Koolhaas being a raver that came up last week. If you go on there, you look at all these pure formalist projects, and like it's like Tom Main's project turned into like a Singer sewing machine. And I find that students that are in school right now are far more critical of pure formalism than they used to be, and they're also asking, what's the point of all of this? They're being asked to spend outrageous amounts of money making these models, and they're being jerked around between all of these different scales of investigation, and they're not getting hired out of school. And so I would say to anyone that says, well, with luxury goods, it takes a lot of, it takes time and money to build something right, and you need to use the best materials. Like, that's not good enough anymore because we're living in a world where we have climate change and you can't tear down a building just because you don't like how it looks. And we all need to be held to a higher standard because the building industry is, I think, second in the most polluting factor in the world and the largest contributor to greenhouse gases. So you cannot be interested in building new projects and then graduate school and not know what the point of that project would be and how it's necessary.
Right.
So I don't mean to sound like someone who is living in a yurt, because I'm not, and I don't like camping. That's Helen's thing.
I love camping.
But I don't understand why we're not talking about this more in school, and I don't understand why material investigations or formalism is enough. It's not.
It's a really good question. I don't have an answer to it. I think this is what makes architecture and architects interesting people, potentially, is that they have the potential and probably the responsibility to be invested in these different things, because that's where architecture, the built environment, transportation, anything built, right? That's where it exists, at the intersections of all these different things. So it does make sense to me. What other kinds of projects do you guys have going on currently in the office?
Well, we're excited to be going back to Wilmington at the invitation of a local council member to support small businesses on Avalon Boulevard. This is a neighborhood that is near the port of Long Beach. It has the most bike lanes in nowhere, 8 oil refineries, and probably one of the most polluted communities. It has a commercial corridor with a lot of small mom and pop businesses. So we're going to be going back out there to do our second phase of small business support work, which is this combination of providing kind of operational and design support to help those businesses better compete and to be a kind of a service to the community members who live around there. So rather than shopping in Torrance and Hawthorne and Long Beach, they can actually go into the neighborhood. So that's something that we're excited to build on our expertise.
So what's the future for you guys? Do you plan to grow massively, or do you think 7 people is around a good size? Are there other kinds of projects you'd like to take on that you maybe just need funding for?
We're just trying to make, affordable housing work at this small scale for the next 2 to 3 years. We really want to see that work. I think we'd like to see that the storefront support that we can offer, we'd like to be able to point to it having outcomes that are tangible and real.
I think
that's the immediate outcome.
The long term, we would love to. Right now, we're helping people become developers, homeowners, business owners, to own and operate and to sustain the operations of what they invest in. So it would be interesting for us to think about what it would be like if LA-Más
if we did that.
Was able to develop on behalf of the community.
That'd be interesting. I mean, it feels like, going back to architecture because we're architects, but even in that field, that the pairing up of real estate and architecture is something I feel like we're saying more and more often, to give architects a bit more agency for either their own vision or for their kind of mission, if it's
for sure
more morally sound or whatever it is.
And you look at Portman and him being a kind of architect developer in the 70s, 60s, offering people an alternative to the sidewalk. And then he was panned, and then everyone was too cool for him. And then the GSD did a huge celebration on him when he died 5 years ago. And then, or John Jurdy, who did City Walk here, or Fremont Street Experience, or Horton Plaza, and really defined the outdoor mall 10 years before it became a fad. And everyone was like, oh, he's evil, he's bad. And I thought in 5 years we'll all be celebrating him. And he did the 1984 Olympics that everybody loves. So I think, what is cool as an architect talking about development is this idea that we could be looking forward to how people want to use public space and supporting that, and then supporting a kind of type of development at a scale that people see as risky, which at this day and age would be a small scale of development, and then being able to say, yeah, you say it's risky, but we're going to do it. And we're going to make an image of it that is so compelling that other people are going to start doing it as well.
It's I often think about I put myself in the architectural field and think it's a shame that today too often architects are brought in after the vision is set. And then you really are just doing the transactional design. And then after that's done, they're like, goodbye, we're going to value engineer what you design because all we really care about is getting to a certain price point. So it's been really interesting to see little moments of architect developers. And there are a handful in Los Angeles, and you probably know a lot more, but even from a affordable housing architect firm, FSY Architects, that developed their own property to,
I think you know more.
FSY Architects, and then there's also I forget the name of the other one who developed 30 small lots on our old Office Street, Coolidge.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they're also architect developers where it's like half their team are general contractors and half their team are architects, and that's actually a really rare kind of combination to find. And that way, you can actually control the design,
They
understand.
end up not developing that project and selling the entitlements to someone else.
That's
to
also
develop.
sometimes what happens.
Yep.
You make
Yep.
more money that way for some. And I just actually went on a tour of Wilshire Grand Center and like learned that like AC Martin and the
Did they get involved in the development of that?
So Chris Martin, who's now leading AC Martin, he's a third generation, and they're kind of a gigantic firm who designed City Hall as well. They
the
designed.
first AC Martin did it.
Yeah, so now they're known as an architecture firm, but they were the developers of the tallest building west of the Mississippi because the person who had the money, which I think is General Chow from Korea, was like, "Will you do it?" And then he was just like, "I'm an architect. I have the capacity to. I've done it in a
I didn't
small
realize
scale."
he was a developer of that.
He developed it. He was given money
him.
to manage like the largest like concrete foundation pour that was the fastest in the world. So that is that's one unique example of someone who kind of did the design and the permitting and didn't have the money but was given the opportunity to be the developer. And that's on a gigantic scale in terms of multi-million, billions of dollars development. But then there's also kind of architects that are still small, 2 to 3 people, and they're thinking like, I don't want to let go of my design and make it transactional if they
Right.
can't find that partner. So that could be interesting to see if there's going to be more kind of architect developers that can kind of own and see through the vision of what they develop. No, but then they're going to have to do it understanding construction costs, community context, like own and operation.
Gotcha. So I know you guys have to get out of here for this meeting and furthering bettering the city. What are some of the greatest challenges you guys face as LA-Más?
Being too ambitious, maybe?
Oh yeah, we are a type A ambitious people who want to do an A+ on every single project we do.
We start these things because we don't see a precedent for them, and we end up building new little tiny LA-Más's inside of LA-Más. And the housing there's no other way to do the Backyard Homes project without creating this full program. There's no way to get storefront projects done and then really support the businesses without also figuring out how to get them to a place where they're operating well. Right? So it's like all of a sudden we just take a few more steps outside of the scope of work and we're in a different field and we're not even noticing that because we're collaborating in different fields all the time. So I think sometimes we kind of expand the reach of what we're doing to a place where no one's going to fund us to do that. We're loving it. And
that's not sustainable.
It's not sustainable.
We just have to learn how to say no or to be mindful of where we focus our energy.
You just have one outcome.
Yeah, sometimes we like to say like let's change the world in 5 different ways, and that's what we're going to aim for in this one little project.
I love it.
We have been told that we need to kind of come to Jesus and just pick one area of focus, and that's just housing. That's been the more common thing to focus on, and we do sometimes wake up on that side of the bed because it's really clear when you house someone, you make their life better.
But our public realm projects, which are unique in the sense that we usually do it within a year, we have a low budget, and we're able to come up with something that ends up looking like it should be 5 times as much as what government has paid for. We're like, well, what is a shade structure really going to do for this person?
We're a little meh on it sometimes.
But we recognize that it is in some ways setting a new precedent for what investment could look like in our public spaces.
We talk about the value of beauty there and the fact that if you're a child and your community doesn't have moments of joy and beauty, what does that do to your psyche and self? And so we can't quantify that, and so we do that work not knowing the outcome of it. But we also do it at the detriment to being able to work on housing. So, and then we do the small business stuff. So it's having these 3 kind of moving pieces that are all work at the community scale that need to get done because no one's doing them. But they burn us out a lot navigating between those realms. And there are businesses who only do one of those things.
Right. Well, that is really interesting, and it all sounds really amazing. And it sounds like it's a lot of fun, despite it being, I'm sure, very taxing.
Yes, we have lots of fun.
A lot of fun, and it's also great to hear that you are starting with some kind of investigation or research or looking into an issue, and you're letting the kind of decision-making process happen as you go along, and you're not shoving stuff to fit within a defined space, which is in turn, of course, what makes it difficult, but it's really exciting. So thank you guys for coming on. This was really, really cool. I'm glad we had you both on. This was great to see you both talk, and perhaps we can do it again in the future.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
We love podcasts.
We need to.
Helen just had some podcast time, about 2 weeks of podcasts.
Yeah, I've never listened to podcasts before, and all of a sudden I was like, whoa, Modern Love, Radio
She had
Lab.
eye surgery,
Yeah.
so she had to be in a dark room for 2 weeks.
Oh, is that why you have the shades on?
Yeah.
Let's plug some of our favorite podcasts. Oh, sorry, is that not good?
Go
No,
for it.
Because then we're taking listeners away from you.
There's plenty of stuff to go around.
We can share listeners,
Mashup Americans.
Oh, I love Mashup Americans.
A dear friend, Becca Lair. She's great on that. What is your...
I've just been listening to all the episodes of Modern Love and Radio Lab. How I Built This is pretty cool, too.
Well, I've heard about that one from like 15 different people. I've yet to turn into it.
I like Reply All a lot. Like a unacceptable amount. Like I'll go like running and listen to it and laugh out loud. And be like, who's that weirdo laughing and running?
That's great. Thanks everyone for listening to this week's episode of the Midnight Charette. We are on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube on occasion. Please subscribe if you like what you're doing, or leave us a review in the podcast app. Those reviews mean something, and that would be greatly appreciated.
And
Right?
of course, we're on YouTube, so please subscribe to our channel. Pretty much each episode has a video, or at least we're trying to do that. We also have a Facebook page, a Facebook group, and our email address if you want to send us any feedbacks, any suggestions on who we should interview, topics you want us to discuss. Feel free to reach out.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you again next week. Bye. Can you say goodbye?
Yeah.
Okay, it's bye. Say goodbye.
Bye bye.
So.